whakatau mā I hui mai nei I runga I te karanga o te kaupapa o tēnei huinga, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I'm very privileged to be here. I don't know, I thought I'd draw the short straw actually after having a feed of pork and kumara. But I think we're at a cutting edge hui about cutting edge philosophies to devise cutting edge strategies. And when I was asked by Leonie to come in to be part of the hui, I wondered if I was the right person. Because I thought it would be for all you academics. Because I think it's fair to say that you can't ever describe me as an academic, and nor would I feel comfortable having that description made of me. I'm more like Moana Jackson and Sid Jackson, you know, the Action Jackson kind of person. And I'm not someone that theorises about the philosophies of our people. I prefer to be embraced by it and to actually practice it. And I find it quite a waste of time sometimes having talk fests which just talk about it, and then I watched people go home and do nothing about it. And so I'm very critical of people that are engaged in university life who I never see with a tea towel at the Marae. And I'm very, very even more critical of people who write about our philosophies and then are gatekeepers on how those philosophies find their way into the institutional life, not of these hallowed places, but the lives of our own children and our families, because many of them are threatened quite often by sharing knowledge, because quite often that means sharing power. And I want to develop that kind of discussion in my presentation this evening. But I also wonder sometimes too whether I am the right one to legitimise these processes, because I really believe that we're at a point in the development of an educational framework for our people where we need to be legitimising the cutting edge strategies of the people like Leonie, Cheryl Smith and Linda that I have the greatest respect for. Because those women single-handedly have turned what was something that was an idea into a very real life of the institutions that we are many involved in, and I think are being exploited by, because of course it's the EFS, the Effective Full-Time Students Program, that actually benefit the institutions. The more Māori students that enrol in the institutions, the more money the institutions get. The more money the institutions get then really determines what kind of programs you have. And that's just the nature of the way the institutions and educations have developed with the privatisation of education, and it worries me. So I just kind of preface what I want to say this evening with those comments. It's an important day in the life of our people too today, because I don't know if many of you would have seen in the paper, the government has signalled quite clearly today, as Rua said, that they will be confiscating 1 million acres of our land when they pass a piece of legislation in the next 3 weeks. That piece of legislation, which is entitled the Foreshore and Seabed Bill, I want to leave no doubts in your mind, is about confiscating Māori land. And I find it absolutely disturbing that that information, that process is going to commence to a conclusion from today through a process that I'm going to describe later on in my presentation. So I actually think sometimes the heavens and the gods come together, or the goddesses come together, so that it gives me a bit of a platform to have another go at the government. I also, just before I actually get into what I wanted to actually kōrero about, I also want to just endorse some of the observations that I made of the, we've had a range of speakers this afternoon, an absolute dynamic range of speakers. And I want to endorse all of their comments that kaupapa Māori isn't something new, it's been here forever, and it's something that has embraced us, all of us, forever. You know, I think the comment that was made for me by Leonie and by Cooney this afternoon, that the process of reclamation of that kaupapa is one that is what we're all about, needs to be given more than intellectual force. And I hope by the end of our discussion this afternoon, we'll try and give you some strategies of how that may be affected. But I also want you to be very aware of the kinds of barriers that exist to the resolution of that kind of outcome. I've got a whakatauaki too. It's hard to title this thing. I thought about entitling my speech from hine ngaro to hine marama, just to think about those kinds of things, you know, from the thinking to the enlightenment. And because it's a feminist approach, I thought that may be a way of actually trying to describe the message I want to leave this evening. But, you know, one of the things that I am very critical about is analysis by paralysis, or paralysis by analysis. It's armchair revolutionaries. It's people who will talk and talk and talk about what things are, but very rarely do things to make what might be an actuality. And so if those are the kinds of things I can try and develop over the next half an hour or so, I look for some provocative questions at the end of it. Ko rangiatea te piringa ko papatuanuku toku whenua tūranga waiwai, ko ngā tāngata koira ngā tū ao. Pau te whenua nō reira au, ko wai a papatuanuku, ko ngā wahanga katoa nō reira mātou. Rangiatea is our shelter. Embedded within papatuanuku is my essence, my place to stand. Humankind are the caregivers of the supreme world. My stake in this world defines who we are. One may ask, who is papatuanuku? My reply, everything within, everything without. That is me, that is us. And that is the pedagogy from which a discussion around Kaupapa Māori philosophies must begin. I struggle sometimes too, even with the use of the word Māori. I think I am a child of the 80s who was certainly inculcated with the philosophies of Rangihau, who said, my tūhoitanga makes me a Māori, my te arawatanga makes me a Māori. So I certainly struggle in definitional terms with the word kaupapa Māori. But if we look at the essence of who we are from the essential beginnings of who we are, then I think it embraces all those unique differences that we are, while finding some universal values that provide a unity of framework from which we can then consider how we give practical application to that. For radical tino rangatiratanga educators, which I hope you all are, the politics, the ethics, the politics of difference, the politics of ensuring tino rangatiratanga is part of our everyday life requires what Pākehā theorists call praxis. And I asked everybody today, how te kupu Māori more praxis? Everybody gives me words like reflection, action, and monitoring or evaluation. But I'm not too sure if we can actually find a word like that in our own philosophies. I tend to see praxis as taking an idea from your mind, ingesting it through your system so that it sits within the bowels of your puku, and from that creates a spiritual essence and a fruit of its own. And I know that certainly is a Māori process not too dissimilar to kai tangata, which we all know about, but it's the ingestion of that whakaaro which is really important, because I have a criticism of Pākehā education is that quite often you're learning as an individual, you're ingesting thoughts through mediums like computer labs now, through media, multimedia mechanisms, and I wonder whether the reflection on the screen is really the kind of reflection that gives force to action and praxis that you require. And when we look at the way we learn as Māori, it is very much the transformation of a whakaaro through an ingestive process to something that bears fruit. And if that is the way we do things, that is our natural way of doing something, then you have to ask yourself in this whole area whether in fact that can be achieved. So as I said today, I don't come here with that theoretical construct. I come here as a practitioner for change. I think it's described sometimes as an agent provocateur, a change agent, a term that has led me to be described by the Prime Minister this year as a hater and wrecker. Because, of course, she doesn't want my kinds of change. She calls me a hater and wrecker because, of course, she's going to resist my change. Because what does she want to do? She wants to maintain the status quo. She wants to continue to deny our Kaupapa Māori a life as the foundational philosophies of our educational institutions. She wants to continue to deny us our status as tangata whenua in Aotearoa. And today, as I've said, she continues to develop policies and practices that marginalise us as Māori, deny us fundamental human rights, steal our land, and she even denies us the right to be equal before her law, not Māori law, before her law. And therefore, she describes me as the hater and wrecker because I challenge the right to do that. And she describes hers as the defender of democracy and the right of the nation state, when that democracy actually takes away fundamental democratic freedoms that all other members of the community enjoy. It is apt too that I stand here not alone, but as part of a collective in the context of the kaupapa, because I can't envisage any definition of kaupapa Māori without other than that being that of a collective. I find it really difficult to construct a philosophical approach to kaupapa Māori pedagogies without starting from that in a collective sense. And I think it's really important too that there's a harmonising of male and female energies in this approach as well. In the same way as I started my discussion this evening, that whakatauaki, the harmonisation between Rangiatea and Papatuanuku, is a fundamental part of the balance of our lives. It is apt that I would be able to also discuss with you strategies to initiate dialogue, to critically evaluate and monitor the colonising state and its agents, to strategise for the reality of change, not just the theoretical possibility of change, and to talk and discuss this evening about how to implement actions and processes designed to challenge the status quo. I mean, I suppose to sum it all up, I am a stroppy bitch. I do believe that you have to be stroppy to make change. And that's one of the difficulties that I find constantly, because when you tend to take on that āhua, our people don't like it. I think they don't like it for lots of reasons. I think we've been pacified, the pacification of terms like tauterangi Marae, and that has been a philosophy certainly that was inculcated both through the churches but through education systems. And where I work in court, you get threatened with things like contempt of court if you're too stroppy, and you get threatened with being struck off if you're really stroppy. And I've found myself over the years once threatened with sedition when you're really stroppy. But, you know, I believe that if we're serious about instituting kaupapa Māori philosophies, we at least need to be stroppy, if not more than stroppy, in seeking the kinds of implementation of action and process to challenge and change the status quo. I want to talk this evening about a number of things, but I want to caution as well and remind us that colonisation is not merely an historical process that once occurred to allow settlers to come here to Aotearoa. It is an ongoing process of marginalisation and manipulation, and it is so because it ensures the permanence of the ideology that the settlers brought here. And you need to understand that if we're really seeking change, we have to be seeking change of the ideology that entrenches the power base of the settlers that came here. And we have to, in my view, challenge that permanence until it stops. The settlers' ideology is as much a philosophical construct as much as it is a tale of economic and military oppression based on fallacious racist assertions that colonists are superior in intellect, in technological advance, or in modern speak, the management of the knowledge economy and the determination of whom shall benefit from their management roles. For too long we have been bombarded with the propaganda that their way, the doctrine of Tina, too often the white, or should I say the right way, is the only way, and that there are no valid alternatives. And I know that today many of the speakers have said we only have to look at the empirical evidence of the last 160 years to show that no, there has to be another way. That right way, the white way, has not been good for us. We only have to look last night on TV. If you were watching the main news, there was all the police conference here in Auckland about how to stop the offending. I think the statistics were that Māori are only 15% of the country, but we make up 66% of the violent offenders and 80% of the repeat offenders of the criminal justice institutions. That's just one statistic from last night. And, you know, this ongoing process of colonisation is very real. The Foreshore and Seabed Bill is a very real process of colonisation that's taking place today. Notwithstanding the overwhelming resistance of our people to the bill, I've been at 14 hui around the motu, where everyone said no, the bill is wrong. I was part of a number of marches in a whole variety of centres, culminating in the great hikoi of 60,000 people that told the country, no, it's not right. I was part of a process of submissions to the Select Committee on the Foreshore and Seabed Bill, where 4,000 people asked to be heard on the bill, but only 232 submissions were selected to be presented to the committee. All of those 4,000 submissions said no. I was part of a process where our people very clearly told the Māori members that they should cross the floor so that the bill would fail. But they said yes. Why do they say yes? It's part of the ongoing process of colonisation that entrenches power and takes power away from us, that entrenches their law and their morals, even when their law and their morals have been judged by international standards to be wrong. It is part of a process that would deny Kaupapa Māori philosophy to be the baseline from all institutions. And it's that which I think I want to emphasise with you tonight, that don't think that colonisation went on an aeroplane last week and packed up and went back, or we sent it back to Tokolau, or wherever we're going to send it back to this week. It's very much alive, and for many of us who are participants in the system, and yes, I'm one of them, we are very much the tools in that coloniser's kit to ensure the entrenchment of their power, to ensure the ascendancy of their ideology, and we become practitioners of that in the name of making money. You know, the processes are reminiscent of colonial imperialism, and I got a definition of what Syed said imperialism is, and I don't really want to go there with that stuff, but nothing has changed since 1860. Today could be just what our tipuna faced in 1860, but in that 1860 there was only 200,000 of our tipuna, and all of them fought to the death to resist it at that time. But in this time, how many of us are prepared to fight it to the death, to resist the things that they are doing now, exactly as they did then? They are taking 1 million acres of our land in this legislation. What are we actually going to do to resist that? I am in courts all the time recalling histories that our people fought, were murdered and killed to ensure that their lands, their philosophies, their way of life was protected. But why don't we in the 21st century do that? Why don't even we go on a hikoi, even though we've got 60,000 people, there's 500,000 of us, why can't even 500,000 of us vociferously demand that those things are wrong and should be rejected? Why? And I suggest that's because many of us are actually caught in the contradictions of our reality. We work for the state. We are part of the colonizer's toolkit. We implement the state's agendas. And while we might not like what we're doing, we don't not do it. We do it to ensure we get paid in what we do. And that's when the Kaupapa Māori philosophy and the practice to ensure the Kaupapa Māori philosophy get into some dilemmas and get into some tension. And we then determine in our heads, well, we can do this much because that's permissible, but we can't go that far because that's too stroppy, or that's breaking their law, or that's going to mean I lose my job, or that might mean that it's not going to be the status quo. Yet, if we want Kaupapa Māori philosophy, we have to challenge the status quo. For those of you who are freaking out, you might be pleased to know I'm actually a pacifist. I'm not into armed revolution, but I do believe in the revolution of the hearts and minds. But I wonder in the Kaupapa Māori theory, how far that theory is actually translated into practice. And the foreshore and seabed example is a classic. Papa Moana is ours. Papa Tuanuku has no one else to defend her except us. Yet we are going to sit placidly and watch the government take, with a stroke of a pen, 1 million of our acres. And they don't even take another 500,000 acres of Pākehā people who have foreshore. They're just going to take the Māori people's foreshore. And I just wonder, when we actually analyse what we do, are we just armchair revolutionaries? Are we just people that talk about the possibility of change until it gets to some levels of uncomfortability? Or are we actually people that will believe in the reality of change and work to that change? Not within comfort zones, but to actually make uncomfortable zones. Because in working to change the status quo, you create discomfort. You create discomfort for yourself personally, you just create discomfort for your communities and the relationships within those communities, and you do so because the status quo is not right. Or you don't do so, and that's what I just have to ask, is it because you don't do so because you think the status quo is right? Then it comes back to me, then why do you even talk about Kaupapa Māori philosophies? Because you're not really going to want Kaupapa Māori philosophies as your baseline. You just want the status quo. And that's the contradiction in the debate. And that's where we are in the cutting edge reality of what we do. And, you know, what's happened in this whole foreshore thing is the clear hegemonic design of policy that is being implemented before our eyes. You know, white people's rights are superior to Māori rights. Pākehā title to the seabed is better than Māori collective tenurial title to the seabed. That's what this bill says. The bill says that for the 50 people that own the foreshore, because you have Pākehā title, you keep your title. We're not touching your land. But all you Māori people, you don't have your title defined by Pākehā law. No, but we have our relationships to Papa Tuanuku defined by whakapapa. But because that's not the same as this, we can take your land and vest it in the Crown while we leave these private property rights alone. And that's the reality of the policy. That is what the status quo wants to achieve. And underpinning the ideology of that status quo is a whole lot of things. Is it that Pākehā title grants more rights than Māori title because Māori are lesser, are inferior, are, as Don Brash described to my uncle Howard Morrison, a subclass? Is that why our rights are inferior? Or is it because Māori are allowing it to happen? Is it because John Tamihere, Dover Samuels, Mita Ririnui, Mahara Okeroa don't want to lose their $90,000? I just found out John had $200,000 job. Because if they voted against it, voted against the status quo, voted against the hegemonic reality that their government is entrenching, we would not have the bill. We would not lose 1 million acres. We would not, in our own psychological thinking, well, Māori rights are less than Pākehā rights, because that's what you believe if you accept the bill to go through. And that then requires to me, well, that's such a blatant answer, that's such a blatant example of what is wrong, yet I don't see us doing what our tipuna did in 1860s. I see some of us marching on the streets. I see a lot of talking about it. I've never seen so many articles written by university observers, but I don't actually see any real change to the status quo happening. And I have to ask myself why. Why doesn't the change really occur? And, you know, I just start to wonder, is it because we actually think we are inferior? That the historic manipulations have actually brainwashed us to believe that our rights, while they're different, are less than other rights? Is it because we've actually got so used to driving flash cars and $60,000 salaries that we actually don't want to live hard? Why, I keep, you know, when there's a stark injustice, why isn't there this sense of resistance, this sense of revolution of heart and mind that our people held last century being inculcated in our communities now? You know, critical perspectives require action. Otherwise it's just armchair revolution. We must not just think about the substance of change, we must action the substance of change. We must not continuously theorize about what might be, we must practice what will be. We must strategize to how we get there. And that's, I think, where I believe this whole regime of Kaupapa Māori initiatives will stand or fall. Kohanga reo stood because we actioned it. Kura kaupapa Māori and all of our other kura stood because we actioned it. Māori television's kind of there, but I'm not too sure if it's going to stand, because I'm not too sure if we're actually actioning it. We're still allowing ourselves to be very co-opted by a framework there and funding inhibitors. But I wonder if the real beauty of Kaupapa Māori philosophical pedagogy will actually be realised if we don't action it. And, you know, discourse in all its meaning, its many forms, its articulation, its definition, it's a major tool of colonisation. You have to be really clear on this too. You know, every analysis that we have quite often draws its legitimacy from Gramsci, from whomever. Occasionally we might quote in our stories of our people, but you know, I read a lot of the theses that come out of universities. You're still drawing your discourse, your legitimacy for your critical analysis from external philosophers. And I wonder, are you really doing that to get your tohu? Or are you doing that to advance the cause of Māori pedagogy? Or are you doing that because it's too hard to find information, because it's just not around? I mean, I know I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But fundamentally, the more we continue to rely on legitimizers from external forces, we actually undermine, through that approach, the legitimacy of our own approaches. The more we write in English, the more we undermine the legitimacy of our philosophical approaches being steeped very much in our kupu mana, the mana of our words, which Ka talked about today. And, you know, I'm one of these that thirsts for Māori work that's written in Te Reo Māori, and there aren't many doctorates that have been produced in our reo rangatira. And those that have, they're gold, because they are so few. But the point that I'm making is, though, the power of discourse is the coloniser's tool. Because when I go to court and I say, well, I want to have so-and-so as my main historical speaker, well, the first question the Crown normally asks them is, where did you get your degree from? And what is the theoretical basis of your proposition? And straight away you're within another framework, and you're being legitimised or undermined by your non-achievement in the Pākehā world, or your non-recognition of Pākehā tohu. And you know, it worries me in the whole debate too, that even when we kind of make big hits like we do in the foreshore and seabed, we get diverted and manipulated off the change from the status quo into talk fests. And this week's been a classic too. Helen Clark's going to announce this weekend her vision of a commission of inquiry about what the New Zealand Constitution might be. That's being announced simultaneously with an announcement next week where our land's going to be taken. Are we going to be diverted to the Constitution debate away from the land? Well, I think we already are. If I look at the papers today, there was no discussion from our media spokespeople around the foreshore and seabed bill. There was heaps today about participation in the constitutional review. And we get manipulated like this all the time, and we get diverted like this all the time, and the discourse gets controlled by the coloniser all the time. Because the terms of reference of that particular review is being determined by political parties, the Green Party, the United Party and the Labour Party, not by Māori people. even though Māori people have the most to lose from that kaupapa. And I illustrate it again in the world that I work in, justice. The issue of representation in the court system for Māori people is always only considered by the colonisers, by the police department, by the courts, by the justice department, by how many of us fail in the system, how many of us go to jail, how many of us in the family court, how many of us are doing that. Yet we all know, because Moana's written a philosophical approach on this in 1984, Ngāti Kahungunu very much involved in this, he said that we need to look at the issue of justice for Māori in a much broader context. We need to look at it in the terms of what does justice mean for Māori. We need to look at the systemic, institutional and constitutional relationships of the system to te tino rangatiratanga, and we need to look at the notion of justice prior to the arrival of the coloniser. We all know this, but did you see that being the discussion point on TV last night at the police? Did you even see that stuff being raised? Did you even see Moana Jackson being invited to talk to that hui? No, what we got was Gabriel Maxwell telling us that our people think the police are racist. Hello, we all know that. But we don't actually get the coloniser inviting us to actually challenge the status quo, to broaden the debate to the Kaupapa Māori philosophies around justice, to ask questions like how was justice defined before 1840 as a philosophy? How was our tikanga operating before 1840? Did Māori have an equivalent tikanga to a Pākehā jurisprudence? What was the institutional expression of justice? Did we have our own legal systems as whānau hapu and iwi? We don't get that kind of discourse being part of an inquiry. What we get is a reformist agenda, a tinkering all on the edges all the time, and we get our kaupapa Māori experts participating in the tinkering without actually challenging the fundamentals. So, we end up with a move to cultural responsiveness. We brown the police force, we brown the judges, we brown the parliamentarians, but we don't change the system. That's all that happens. So the theory is right, the kaupapa Māori philosophy tells us it's right, but we don't actually go in to change the system. And my experiences, which we're going to talk about in a minute, with kaupapa Māori rangahau in justice is just, it's appalling. And the gatekeepers are the brown people now. They're not the white people, it's the systems people, but the gatekeepers to us even researching our own philosophies are the brown judges, many of whom are recent appointments and don't have our reo, but because they're Māori, they're meant to suddenly become a tohunga and things Māori. They've never done Māori in their lives, some of them. One was a Crown prosecutor, and suddenly now he's an expert on te reo Māori me ona tikanga, and I've never heard him speak. And it really upsets me that we allow it to happen. And why do we allow it? Because Tauterangi Māori, Annette, he's learning te reo, so he's the one on the paipai, and you see a judge get up, and give a cup of tea kōrero, while we've got all of these women sitting behind him who have got the absolute tohunga realms of our reo silenced while he takes the platform representing the Justice Department at a poiri. And why do we allow that to happen? Because that's the status quo. He's a rangatira in their system. He's still got a long way to becoming a rangatira in our system, yet we elevate him. We elevate him over our own tohunga. And we do that because that's what our tikanga demands? Or do we do that because the system has made that demand? And it really this is the stuff that I think is the hard stuff, and there's not many of us on the ground doing the challenging that is wrong. And when we do the challenging, we normally make another headline. But, you know, I don't know, these are the kinds of realities and the barriers to change that I confront daily. And in terms of this hui, one of the things I wanted to just briefly talk about is an effort we've made to try and move the pedagogy of historical research. So we decided, our team, and Jason's going to talk about it shortly, that we would try and change that approach, that we would try and get customary research reports written in te reo tūhoi, te reo taranaki, te reo tarawa. We wouldn't look for people with doctorates, we would look for people that were steeped in the tikanga and the practices of the communities that were making claims. And we would look for actually researching the claims from a standpoint that's quite different. And we have been now trying for 3 years for this to happen. And the tūhoi claims are nearly finished. And the resistance to this, what I think is simple initiative, the greatest resistance has come from Māori people who are in that industry with doctorates, who fear that if this goes, they will lose their jobs. And it is really worrying for me that the same people use who we want as our researchers as their informants, change what they say, rely on bits and pieces of what they say to justify the pedagogy of the oppressor. And I've got some booklets that if you want to, we've set out the memorandums we wrote to the court about the approach. We've set out all the kinds of things, and we put in together some affidavits that Jason's going to refer to show that it can be done, and that we are doing it notwithstanding we're not getting funding, but the injustice of it continues. And what worries me is we have Waitangi Tribunal reports constantly being said to be telling Māori history, when I actually just think that they're regurgitating history about Māori people recorded by Pākehā. And is that any different to the status quo? Is that what Kaupapa Māori philosophies want? Is that what we really are here about? Because I hope it's not, because I know there's a lot of people in this room with masters and doctorates. Because I don't want that. In fact, I want the Waitangi Tribunal to go away. I want our own system. But if that's what you see as a measure of success of Kaupapa Māori, I have some real problems with that huarahi and whether or not we're going to be successful. But it's not all doom and gloom in this world of practice, because I'm excited, as I said in my kōrero. When I was at university here, I left here in the middle 80s, there was a small team of people, Graham Smith and Linda, Cheryl, Leonie, Margie Hohepa, Trish Johnson and Kuni. They were this unit that were coming up with this whole philosophy. And now there's all of you. And that is only good. You know, that's 10 years and we've got this regeneration of people committed to a philosophical approach that was denied and suppressed for 160 years. But I'm part of this precautionary principle that they talk about in international law. It's all very well to create all of you, but if you're all going to just continue to practice in the status quo, I wonder what we're actually creating. You know, I know that many of us go to university to earn lots of money and make be honest. That's why you go to university. You go there to get a job. I know that the universities and the schools now very much have got governments determining what kind of courses they offer as part of their knowledge economy thrust, as part of what they identify in the global markets and the new liberal philosophies are going to be good for New Zealand. And those targeted outcomes are very much the kinds of things that have designed the courses that you participate in. So I am worried that we're going to just create a lot of brown researchers, a lot of brown doctorates who just participate in their system. And I don't want that. And I don't want that because I'm a brown lawyer that participates in their system. And I had hoped that by the time I was 40, I would be participating in our system. And I don't want us to spend another 20 years down that track. It didn't work. I went in with a number of Māori lawyers of that wave with this desire to go in and make our own system. What I've watched is all my colleagues get co-opted into their system, into very entrenched systems of power, positions of power. Power that sees them sit on a bench 8 hours a day sending our people to jail. That's not changing the status quo. That's just making it easier for us as Māori to swallow. And that's, I suppose, one of the things I just like to leave with us to think about in the practice of what we do. The other good thing, though, is that this year, hell of a lot of people I'd never seen went on a march this year. People that I would never have believed would have gone on a march. People from the State Services Commission. People who I'd never, ever seen in Rotorua. Howard Morrison, go on a hikoi for the foreshore. People who feel some sense of comfort in resisting the status quo. Now, that is testimony to the fact of the decolonisation strategies that are occurring in our communities, to the fact that the histories you people are developing are registering in the hearts and minds of our people, so they don't want to just be armchair revolutionaries, they want to be part of a movement for change. But sustaining that is the challenge to all of us. Because once it becomes a struggle as opposed to an afternoon stroll, then it gets harder and harder for people like the Howard Morrisons of the world to come out. He said on TV he couldn't come because he had a heart disease or something. Well, in April that didn't stop him. And I think so those are the signals of hope. And there are some cautionary warnings of gloom. I am really worried about the brown gatekeepers. They're really bad. Most of them are funders, or they control the design of programs. And most of them have this sense that because they've got a doctorate, they're better than everybody else who doesn't. And that's wrong. That's just so wrong. So what if you got a doctorate? Did you spend 10 years washing the dishes at the pa so you could get your doctorate? There's a whole set of values there that I think really need to be explored and discussed and challenged. And these things are entrenched. One of the things in law, for instance, if you're an expert witness, you become an expert because you're recognised by your qualifications. They don't recognise our tohungas as experts. They call opinion witnesses. So they immediately subjugate our tohunga into a different identity framework than an expert with a tohu. And those have real application in the things that I do in my job. And I don't want to go there, but they will, if you certainly move into that area, they will certainly impact on the way you do things in the current processes. So I'm going to hand over to Jason, and he's going to talk about, in concluding our presentation, just how our people approach issues in a different way and how the system can't cope with that approach. And we're going to use some examples from the Native Land Court and how our people have criticised the Native Land Court and how our people gave evidence around the foreshore and seabed debate to illustrate the quite contextual differences of our people's thinking and how the system just can't cope with that, but won't change because they say they can't change to that.